You close your eyes, and the sound of the sea returns. Not the crashing waves of storms, but the steady rhythm that has always called to humankind, the endless breathing of the world itself. Tonight, we follow the story of Jan Vanliden, a farm boy who left his quiet Dutch village in search of fortune across the world's oceans. Through scorching decks, tropical ports, roaring tempests, and silent dawns at sea, he will face hunger, fear, and the vast loneliness of the horizon. Yet beyond the hardship lies something greater: understanding, resilience, and the quiet peace of a life fully lived. This is the journey of a man shaped by the sea, and the sea shaped by his memory. The lowlands stretched out in shades of brown and green, broken only by narrow canals glinting in the weak Dutch sun. It was spring, and the smell of damp earth carried over the flat fields, promising another year of toil. To most men of South Holland, it was a familiar comfort: cows to milk, hay to cut, fences to mend, and the endless rhythm of sowing and harvest. But to Jan Vanliden, standing in the furrows of his father's farm with mud clinging to his boots, it felt more like a prison. He had never been one for stillness. As a boy, he had run faster than the other children, climbed higher, and dreamed bigger. The stories that trickled into the village from passing traders, of lands where the sun blazed all year, of fruits that burst with colors unknown, of ships so large they could swallow the church whole, these had burrowed into his mind like seeds. And now, at 18, they had grown into restless vines, tugging him away from the soil his father loved. His father, Peter Vanliden, was a man built from the land itself, broad, weathered, silent. The farm was his kingdom and labor his creed. He believed in strong backs and steady hands, not wandering thoughts. That morning, as Jan dropped his hoe and straightened to ease the ache in his shoulders, Peter's voice rang out across the field. Less dreaming, more work. Jan swallowed the retort on his tongue. He had learned long ago that arguments with his father ended only one way, with Peter's stern gaze like iron bars across his will. But silence did not mean obedience. His heart beat with rebellion. That night, after supper of rye bread and cheese, Jan lingered by the fire while his brothers and sister drifted to bed. His mother, soft-eyed but weary, mended a shirt. His father sharpened a scythe with slow, methodical strokes. The sound grated at Jan's nerves like the pull of an anchor chain. "Father," he began cautiously, "what if there were more than this? What if a man wished to see the world?" The whetstone paused mid-stroke. Peter's eyes lifted, sharp as knives. "The world beyond these fields is hunger, plague, and war. Here we have land, bread, a roof. That is enough." "Enough for you, perhaps," Jan whispered. He hadn't meant for his voice to tremble, but it did. Peter stood, towering, and set down the scythe. "A farm does not run on dreams, boy. You will inherit this land. You will plow it, sow it, and die upon it as I did, as my father before me." Something inside Jan broke at those words, not with a snap, but with the slow tearing of cloth. He nodded outwardly, though his chest burned with defiance. That night he lay awake in the loft, listening to the soft snores of his brothers, staring at the beams above. In the darkness, he imagined the creak of ship timbers, the salt sting of wind, the horizon unbroken by fields. He could not die in this village without ever knowing what lay beyond the gray North Sea. The decision grew like dawn. 2 weeks later, Jan stood at the edge of the village with nothing but a rough sea chest, a small purse of coins saved from odd jobs, and his mother's tearful kiss lingering on his cheek. She had said nothing to stop him, though her eyes had pleaded. Perhaps she remembered her own youthful dreams before life bound her here. His father had not come to see him off. The silence between them was final, heavy as the clods of earth Jan left behind. The road to Amsterdam wound past dikes and windmills, through villages busy with markets and chatter. Each step carried him further from the familiar rhythms of his childhood and closer to the unknown. At night, he slept in barns, paying farmers a coin for the privilege. By day, he followed carts laden with cheese, wool, and barrels of herring bound for the city. On the third evening, he crested a low rise and saw it at last, Amsterdam. Its church spires pricked the sky, its windmills turned lazily in the spring breeze, and beyond the rooftops lay the glittering forest of masts in the harbor. His breath caught in his throat. Ships, hundreds of them, crowded together, their sails furled, their rigging a maze against the fading light. He had heard tales, but no tale could prepare him for the sight. The sea's great wooden beasts waiting to devour men whole. Excitement warred with fear. In the streets near the docks, the air was thick with the cries of vendors, the briny stink of fish, and the smoke of taverns. Sailors staggered with tankards in hand, their laughter spilling into alleys where children begged for coins. Posters nailed to posts bore the seal of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, offering wages to those willing to brave the ocean to Java, Ceylon, and beyond. Jan clutched his chest tighter. He had reached the edge of the known world. His farm boy calluses meant nothing here. But in his veins, something stirred, the same hunger that had driven him from his father's fields. The sea was waiting. Amsterdam was not a city, it was a storm. Jan felt it the moment he crossed beneath the great city gates, the press of bodies, the hammer of hooves on cobblestones, the endless chorus of voices speaking Dutch, French, German, and tongues he couldn't name. To a farm boy used to the rhythm of cows and plows, it was like stepping into another universe. The harbor was the heart of it all. Hundreds of ships rocked in the water, their tall masts spearing the sky, sails furled like sleeping wings. The smell of pitch, salt, and tar clung to everything. Dockside workers shouted as they rolled barrels and hauled crates. Men with weathered faces bargained loudly over wages. Soldiers in VOC coats patrolled with muskets on their shoulders, their expressions as hard as stone. Jan drifted wide-eyed through the chaos. Here was everything he had dreamed: adventure, wealth, the promise of lands far beyond the horizon. Yet for all its splendor, he soon learned it was also a place thick with traps. At a corner tavern, its doorway spilling smoke and laughter, he paused. A painted sign above the door read the Golden Anchor. Inside, the air was warm and loud, full of beer fumes and shanties sung off-key. Jan hesitated, but his thirst and curiosity pushed him forward. He hadn't gone 3 steps into the room before a hand clapped his shoulder. "First time in Amsterdam, eh?" Jan turned to find a man in his 30s, lean, sharp-eyed, with a smile that seemed to stretch too wide. He wore a sailor's jacket but carried himself like someone who hadn't hauled a rope in years. "Yes," Jan admitted cautiously. The man's grin widened. "Hendrik's the name. And you, lad?" "January." "Well, Jan, you're in luck." Hendrik leaned in close, his breath thick with beer. "You've come at the right time. The East India ships are sailing soon, and they need strong lads like you. The pay's good, better than a farm will ever give you. 3 guilders a month, plus food, plus adventure. Think of it, Java, Ceylon, spices worth their weight in gold. 1 voyage and you'll be a rich man." Jan's heart thudded. Rich man. The words sang inside him like bells. Yet he remembered his father's warning. The world beyond these fields is hunger, plague, and war. Still, Hendrik's voice was smooth, confident, like a hand guiding him toward destiny. "I don't know the sea," Jan confessed. "None of yous did at first," Hendrik chuckled. "It's simple enough. Pull a rope, swab a deck, stand your watch. Easy work compared to digging in mud. And when you return, you'll have stories, coin in your purse, and women chasing after you." A chorus of laughter rose from nearby tables where sailors toasted loudly, their mugs overflowing with foam. Jan watched them with awe. They looked worn and scarred, yes, but also alive in a way no farmer ever did. "Come with me," Hendrik urged, slipping an arm around Jan's shoulders. "I'll show you the sign-up house. VOC recruiters are waiting. They'll feed you, house you tonight, and by dawn you'll have a berth on a fine ship. No better chance will come, lad." Jan hesitated. He had only a small purse of coins. He'd thought to find lodging, perhaps work for a few weeks before deciding. Yet Hendrik's words pressed against his doubts like a tide against the shore. "What's the cost?" Jan asked. "Cost?" Hendrik laughed. "No cost at all. The company pays you. All you do is sign your name." They stepped back into the street. The harbor wind hit Jan's face, cool and briny. Hendrik steered him toward a squat stone building with the VOC emblem carved above the door. A proud monogram, symbol of Dutch power. Lantern light flickered from within. Men stood in line outside, some eager, some already drunk, some looking as though they'd been dragged there. Jan's stomach nodded. Inside, the air smelled of ink, wax, and authority. A clerk in black robes sat at a heavy desk, quill scratching across parchment as names were written, oaths sworn. Hendrik whispered in Jan's ear, "Just sign, lad. Once your name's on their list, you're one of them. A sailor of the company. The world is yours." The clerk's eyes flicked to him. "Name?" Jan's throat dried. He thought of his father's fields, of his mother's embrace, of the village where boys dreamed of adventure but rarely left. Then he thought of the masts in the harbor, of ships that could take him beyond the horizon to places where fruits glowed like jewels and spices carried fortunes. Jan Vanliden, he said, his voice steady. The quill scratched. Ink sealed his fate. When they stepped back into the night, Hendrik clapped him on the back. There now. Easy as a pint of ale. Tomorrow you'll be aboard the Batavia's Pride. A good ship bound for the Indies. You've done well, boy. Done well indeed. Jan forced a smile, but inside doubt gnawed. The ink on that page felt heavier than the plow he had left behind. He had dreamed of this moment, yet already he sensed the bargain was not as simple as Hendrik claimed. The sea had called him. Now it had him. Morning in Amsterdam broke gray and wet, the kind of drizzle that soaked through wool and left the cobblestones slick. Jan woke on a straw pallet in a cramped dormitory above the VOC recruitment hall. Hendrik had vanished sometime in the night, leaving only the echo of his promises. Around him, other boys and men stirred, farm hands, apprentices, vagrants, each clutching a small bundle of belongings, each with the same nervous hunger in their eyes. A bell clanged below, and the shouting of an overseer cut through the damp air. Downstairs, all of you. You sail today. The room erupted in hurried movement. Jan pulled on his rough shirt and cloak, his chest pounding. Today. He had thought there would be time, days at least, before departure. Instead, the company wasted no moments. Downstairs, the clerk from the night before sat again at his table, parchment spread out, wax seals ready. An officer in a long coat stood nearby, hand resting on the hilt of his sword. No one spoke against the process. Step forward. Name, the clerk said. One by one, the recruits gave their names. The clerk read aloud their obligations in a dry monotone. 5 years of service under the charter of the United East India Company, wages of 3 guilders a month, obedience to captain and officers under penalty of lash or death. Each man pressed a trembling hand to the quill, signing his mark if he could not write. When Jan's turn came, the clerk's eyes barely flickered. Jan Vanliden. Occupation? Farmer's son, Jan said, embarrassed by the smallness of it. The clerk nodded, unimpressed. Now you are company property. Jan took the quill. The ink blotted, the letters clumsy under his nervous grip. When he finished, the clerk sprinkled sand to dry it and pushed the paper aside. Next. It was done. The officer barked orders, and the new recruits were herded out into the street. A drizzle still fell, chilling their necks. Ahead, down toward the harbor, a line of soldiers marched them through narrow alleys until the ships came into view again, their towering masts vanishing into the low clouds. Jan felt a strange mix of awe and dread. He had signed away years of his life with a single stroke of ink. The contract bound him tighter than iron chains. Yet when his eyes fell on the great hull of the Batavia's Pride waiting at anchor, something inside him leapt. This was the gateway to the world he had dreamed of. At the quay, a gangplank connected shore to ship. Officers called names, checking them against the lists. A boatswain with a voice like thunder shouted for silence. You are no longer farm boys or beggars. You are sailors of the company. You will obey or you will hang from the yardarm. Step lively. Jan moved with the others, his chest tight as he placed his foot on the gangplank. The timbers creaked beneath him. Salt wind hit his face for the first time. He crossed onto the deck of the Batavia's Pride. Chaos surrounded him. Men hauling barrels, riggers climbing aloft, carpenters hammering. Officers strode about with canes, striking at anyone too slow. The deck smelled of tar, sweat, and stale beer. It was a city afloat, but one where discipline ruled with the lash. Stow your gear below, the boatswain bellowed. You'll find hammocks if you're lucky. Otherwise the deck will do. Move. Jan followed a narrow hatchway down into the bowels of the ship. The air grew foul instantly, thick with damp wood and old sweat. Hammocks swayed in the gloom, some already claimed. Rats darted across beams. The low ceiling forced him to stoop. This is it, muttered a pale boy beside him. Our new home. Jan nodded grimly. His chest ached for the open fields of home, for the fresh wind over pasture. Yet here, below decks, was the life he had chosen. Or rather, the life chosen for him once he'd signed that cursed parchment. Back on deck, the officers wasted no time. The anchor was hauled, sails unfurled, and the ship creaked as it caught the wind. The harbor slipped away, Amsterdam's spires fading into mist. Jan gripped the railing, watching his homeland disappear. He felt suddenly smaller than he had ever known, a single speck carried by a vast, merciless sea. Cornelis, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek, sidled up beside him. "First time?" Jan nodded. Cornelis smirked, his teeth yellowed. "Then listen, farm boy. Forget Hendrik's lies. The Indies are no paradise. You'll eat salt pork until your teeth rot, drink water full of worms, and watch half your shipmates die before you ever see Java. But if you live," he tapped the side of his nose, "there's profit. Always profit if you know how to play it." Jan stared at him, stunned. Cornelis chuckled darkly and moved on, leaving Jan gripping the rail as the gray waves stretched endlessly ahead. Behind him, the bosun's whistle shrieked. All hands, to work. The voyage had begun. The Batavia's pride was not the gleaming vessel Hendrik had promised. From a distance, her tall masts and billowing sails looked noble, but up close she was scarred wood and rusted iron, patched by hurried carpenters who had seen too many voyages. The ship creaked and groaned like an old woman, though she was still considered young in the company's fleet. Jan's first full day aboard taught him that life at sea was not measured in horizons but in orders. The bosun's whistle shrilled at dawn, and the men stumbled to their stations half asleep. The air was cold and damp, the deck slick with spray. Jan's hands burned raw within hours as he hauled ropes, scrubbed planks, and carried water casks. The officers barked at every mistake, their canes quick to strike shoulders and backs. "Faster, farm boy," a mate snarled when Jan fumbled with a knot. "The rope won't wait for you, and neither will the sea." Jan bit back a retort, fumbling until his fingers obeyed. His muscles ached in ways the farm had never prepared him for. Plowing fields was steady, predictable work. This was chaos. One moment he was ordered aloft to unfurl a sail in the biting wind. The next he was on his knees scrubbing filth with seawater until his knuckles split. Below deck was worse. The sleeping quarters were crammed, hammocks slung so close that men brushed against one another with every sway of the ship. The air reeked of sweat, mildew, and the chamber pots that sloshed with each roll. Rats darted freely, bold as soldiers. That night, exhausted, Jan collapsed into a hammock only to be shaken awake by a sailor with gray stubble and eyes like iron. "You're in my berth, boy," the man growled. Jan scrambled up, apologizing. He had not realized hammocks were claimed, invisible territories marked by habit and seniority. "Careful," the sailor muttered. "You'll make enemies fast that way." The man studied him for a long moment before extending a rough hand. "Peter over water. Been at sea longer than I care to count." Jan shook it gratefully. "January. First voyage." Peter's gaze softened slightly. "I could tell. You look like I did once, before the sea carved the boy out of me. Listen well, January. The officers don't care if you live or die. Disease will kill as many as storms. And the company? They'll send another ship full of fools like us to replace you. But if you learn fast, keep your head down, and never waste food or water, you might just live long enough to come home." Jan swallowed hard. "And if I don't?" Peter's mouth curved into something like a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Then the sea keeps you. That's her bargain." Over the next days, Peter's words proved true. The Batavia's pride was a world governed by rules harsher than any Jan had known. Lateness meant lashes. Laziness meant double duty. Talking back meant worse. Men whispered of a boy who had once been tied to the mast and flogged until he could no longer stand, his back shredded like meat. Jan kept silent, his fear sharpening into obedience. But Peter, for all his grimness, taught him how to coil a rope so it wouldn't tangle when needed, how to balance on the ratlins high above the deck without looking down, how to ration water, sip by painful sip, so his throat would not dry out before the next allowance. Cornelis, the scarred sailor, offered lessons of another kind. "The company watches the big cargo," he whispered one night, eyes glinting. "Pepper, silk, porcelain. But small things? A handful of nutmeg, a pouch of cloves? Slip them into your chest and no one asks questions. That's how men like us make real money. Not from wages." Jan listened, torn between fascination and fear. His father's voice echoed faintly in memory, warning of dishonor and greed. But the hunger inside him, the same hunger that had driven him to leave, answered louder. On the fourth evening, the captain addressed the crew. He was a tall man, face like weathered oak, eyes sharp as glass. "We sail for Batavia. Some of you will not see her. Some of you will not return. But for those who endure, there are riches and there is glory, for yourselves and for the Republic. Obey your officers, fear God, and trust the company." The men cheered half-heartedly, more from habit than belief. Jan watched in silence, feeling both smaller and older than he had days ago. The world of fields and farms had fallen behind him. Ahead stretched only the endless gray of the sea. That night, lying awake in a corner of the deck where he had found space, he listened to the groaning timbers, the snap of sails, and the muttered snores of the crew. The realization settled on him like the damp mist. There was no turning back. The farm boy was gone. A sailor, half-formed, half-afraid, took his place. The morning of departure came with a sound Jan would never forget. The deep groan of ropes straining, the chorus of orders shouted across the deck, the boatswain's whistle slicing through the damp air. The Batavia's pride was alive, shuddering as her anchor rose inch by inch from the dark harbor water. Amsterdam's harbor bustled with activity. Families crowded the quay, waving handkerchiefs, shouting blessings or curses to sons and husbands departing. Vendors hawked last-minute provisions, cheese, bread, jugs of beer, while ship's boys scrambled to haul them aboard. Over it all, the church bells tolled, a mournful farewell that echoed across the water. Jan stood at the rail, gripping the damp wood as the ship shifted beneath him. He searched the crowd but saw no familiar face. His father had refused to come. His mother, though she had wept when he left the farm, would not have had the strength to watch him vanish. Jan was alone in this farewell, one anonymous sailor among hundreds. The captain strode the quarterdeck, his voice carrying over the din, raised the sails. Canvas cracked as the great sheets unfurled. The wind caught, filling them with a thunderous snap. Slowly, the Batavia's pride eased away from the quay. The crowd on shore grew smaller, their voices lost in the distance. Ahead lay only the gray expanse of the North Sea, its waves rolling under a sky of low clouds. As Amsterdam faded, excitement gave way to dread. The ship pitched more violently once clear of the sheltered harbor. Jan's stomach rebelled almost instantly. He staggered to the side, clutching his gut, and emptied what little breakfast he had managed down into the churning water. Laughter erupted behind him. Cornelis leaned on the rail, grinning. "Ah, the sea takes her toll, farm boy. Don't worry, it'll get worse before it gets better." Peter's voice cut through the mockery. "Enough, Cornelis. Every man pays his due. You'll learn to stand steady, Jan, or the sea will throw you over herself." For 3 days, Jan lived in misery. The deck swayed under his feet as though the earth itself had betrayed him. Every rope he touched burned his hands raw. Every shouted order felt like another lash of punishment. Sleep brought no relief. The hammocks swung like pendulums, and the stink of vomit filled the lower deck. He wondered if he had made the gravest mistake of his life. But the work left no room for despair. The officers drove the crew mercilessly. Water barrels had to be secured, sails trimmed, livestock tended. Even sick men were forced to haul lines or scrub decks. Those who lagged felt the sting of the bosun's ropes end across their backs. On the 4th morning, pale and trembling, Jan forced himself up the ratlins for the first time. The mast loomed like a tower against the sky. Below, the sea boiled, endless and merciless. His hands slipped with sweat, but Peter climbed beside him, his voice calm. "Eyes on the rope, not the sea. Grip with your legs. Trust your weight." Jan obeyed, breath ragged. When he reached the yardarm, the wind tore at him, threatening to fling him into the abyss. He clung to the wood, heart hammering. But then, something shifted. His balance steadied. He tied the line as Peter showed him, and for a heartbeat, he looked out at the horizon. It was terrifying. It was magnificent. By the time he climbed down, his body shook with exhaustion, but a strange pride flickered in his chest. That night, over the thin gruel served in wooden bowls, Peter nodded at him. "You didn't fall. That's more than I can say for some on their first climb." Cornelis raised his mug with a mocking grin. "A proper sailor now, eh? Just wait until the storms come. Then you'll wish for your father's cows again." Jan said nothing, but inside he held to the brief moment atop the mast. For the first time since leaving home, he felt a spark of belonging. The voyage had only begun, yet already the sea was reshaping him. Not into the rich adventurer Hendrik had promised, not into the obedient farmer his father had wanted, but into something new, something forged in salt, wind, and fear. The first death came quietly. A week after departure, the ship's carpenter's mate failed to rise for morning muster. When they dragged him from his hammock, his skin was gray, his lips cracked, and his breath shallow. The surgeon, Jansen, examined him with a practiced eye and shook his head. Fever. Nothing to be done. Nothing to be done. The words haunted Jan as he watched the man decline. By evening, the mate's groans had ceased. He lay still, eyes half open, staring at nothing. Jan had never seen death come so quickly. On the farm, it was slow. An old cow that weakened through seasons, a grandmother fading over years. This was different. Here, death came like a thief, swift and merciless. The officers wasted no time. A sailmaker sewed the body into a length of canvas, a round shot tied at the feet. The crew gathered on deck at dawn. The sea was calm, the sky pale with early light. The captain read a few words from scripture. The boatswain's whistle blew. The wrapped body slid from the plank, splashing into the gray water. For a moment, the canvas floated. Then the weight pulled it down, vanishing into the deep. Jan gripped the rail, throat tight. The carpenter's mate had spoken only 2 words to him the week before. Past that. Now he was gone, claimed by the sea as if he had never existed. Cornelis leaned close, his tone mocking but edged with truth. Best get used to it, farm boy. The sea takes a third of us, sometimes more. If you can't watch a man vanish without crying, you won't last long. Jan wanted to snap at him, but Peter's steady hand on his shoulders silenced the anger. Respect the dead, Peter said simply. His voice was quiet, but it carried enough weight that Cornelis looked away. That night, Jan lay awake in the foul air of the lower deck. Around him, men muttered in their sleep, some whimpering, some silent as stones. He stared at the swaying beams overhead, listening to the creak of the ship. Somewhere below, water sloshed against the hull. He imagined the canvas-wrapped body sinking ever deeper, swallowed by blackness. Was that all they were? Weights dropped into the ocean, forgotten by morning? The next week brought more sickness. A boy from Zealand, no older than Jan, developed sores on his gums. He bled when he chewed the hard biscuits. Soon after, another man's legs swelled until he could no longer stand. Dr. Jansen moved among them with weary detachment. He had seen it all before. Scurvy, he muttered, or the flux. Either way the sea chooses. Jan tried to eat sparingly to save what little dried fruit was given, but the rations were pitiful. Mostly they lived on salted pork and ship's biscuit crawling with weevils. Water stank after days in the barrel, thick with slime. Sometimes he had to close his nose and drink anyway, gagging it down to keep alive. Work continued regardless. The dead were carried off watch, their tasks filled by the living. Jan learned knots until his fingers bled. He climbed rigging in icy winds until his arms shook with fatigue. He scrubbed decks until his back ached like fire. Always under the gaze of the officers, always with the lash a heartbeat away. One evening, as he scraped tar from a block, Jan asked Peter, "Does it always happen this way? Men dying so soon?" Peter's eyes were shadowed. "Always. The sea is patient, January. She takes men one by one, until only the stubborn or the lucky remain." Jan swallowed, fear gnawing at him. "And you? Why are you still here?" Peter smiled grimly. "Because I am too stubborn to give her the satisfaction." That night, another burial. The wind howled, waves slapping hard against the hull. The deck pitched, and Jan had to cling to the rail as the canvas slid over the side. The sea swallowed the body instantly this time, no ceremony, no pause. Just gone. The realization struck Jan like a blow. Hendrik's promises of fortune, of adventure. They had never mentioned this. The company's posters never showed men sewn into canvas and fed to the ocean. They had promised riches. They had delivered death. And yet, Jan could not look away. He felt horror, yes, but also a strange determination. If the sea was a test, then he would endure. He would not be the next to vanish beneath the waves. When he finally lay in his hammock, exhaustion pressing him down, he whispered a promise into the dark. "I will survive this voyage, no matter the cost." The ship creaked, the sails groaned, and the sea whispered back, indifferent. The weeks that followed were a blur of aching muscles, shouted orders, and bitter cold. Jan quickly learned that survival at sea was not just about avoiding sickness. It was about mastering the endless grind of labor that kept the ship alive. Every day brought new tasks, hauling ropes until his shoulders screamed, climbing the rigging to furl sails in winds that threatened to rip him loose and fling him into the gray void below, scrubbing decks with salt and sand until his hands bled. There was no end to it and no mercy for mistakes. The first time Jan fumbled a knot, the bosun's mate struck him across the back with a rope's end. "Faster, boy. That line won't wait for your clumsy fingers." The sting burned worse than the winter wind. Jan wanted to curse, to shout back, but Peter's steady glance held him. Later, when the officers were out of earshot, Peter said, "Take the blow and learn. Better bruises than a flogging." Jan clenched his teeth. He hated the humiliation, but he began to see the truth in Peter's words. Life aboard ship was an endless test of endurance. Pride had no place here. Only obedience and skill kept a sailor alive. Still, not all lessons were taught with cruelty. Peter, when he had the chance, showed Jan how to coil a rope so it wouldn't tangle, how to splice lines, how to climb the rigging without wasting energy. He had a patience the officers lacked. "Every knot has its purpose," Peter explained one night, guiding Jan's hands as they worked by lantern light. "Get it wrong and the sail tears. Get it right and the ship flies." Jan found himself listening with rapt attention. In Peter's calm instructions, he glimpsed something beyond survival, craft, skill, even a kind of pride in doing the work well. But Cornelis was another kind of teacher. Where Peter taught patience, Cornelis taught cunning. One evening, when the ration of salted pork was doled out, Cornelis slipped Jan an extra strip. "From a fool too drunk to guard his portion," Cornelis whispered, smirking. Lesson 1: the sea rewards those who take. Jan hesitated. Hunger gnawed at his belly, but something in him recoiled at the theft. Cornelis laughed softly. "Suit yourself, farm boy. But remember this, out here virtue won't keep you alive. Stomach full, maybe it will." He stuffed the meat in his mouth, chewing with exaggerated relish. The ship itself seemed to conspire against them. Storms blew up without warning, driving rain that soaked them to the bone. The deck pitched and rolled like a living beast, flinging men across the planks if they weren't quick with their hands. One night, Jan nearly lost his footing in the rigging, his fingers slipping on the wet ropes. The sea yawned below, black and endless. For a heartbeat, he thought he was finished. Then Peter's voice cut through the wind. "Hold fast, Jan. Trust the line." Jan tightened his grip, muscles screaming, and somehow hauled himself back onto the ratlins. When he reached the deck again, shaking and pale, Peter said only, "You'll make a sailor yet." But Jan's body bore the cost. His hands were raw from ropes, his back striped from lashes and bruises. His skin cracked from salt and wind. At night, when he finally collapsed into his hammock, every muscle throbbed with exhaustion. He often dreamt of home, the warm kitchen, the smell of baking bread, his mother's gentle voice. The contrast was almost unbearable. And yet, gradually something inside him hardened. The farm boy who had boarded the Batavia's pride was fading. In his place grew a sailor, leaner, tougher, eyes sharper to the shift of clouds, ears tuned to the creak of sails. One afternoon, Jan was ordered to help furl the topsail as a squall approached. The wind screamed, whipping the canvas like a living thing. The officer shouted at him to hurry. His hands fumbled at first, the canvas snapping and threatening to tear free. Panic surged. But then he remembered Peter's words, "Every knot has its purpose." He steadied his breath, tied the reef knot firmly, and the sail held. When he descended, drenched but alive, the officer gave a curt nod. "Better?" It was the closest thing to praise Jan had heard since leaving Amsterdam. That night, Cornelis clapped him on the back. "Not bad, farm boy. You might even survive this cursed voyage after all." Jan managed a thin smile, but inside he felt something stir. For the first time, survival didn't feel impossible. He was learning the ship's language, its ropes, its sails, its moods. He was still a novice, but no longer helpless. The lesson was clear: the sea did not forgive weakness. But it rewarded those who endured, who adapted, who learned. And Jan, scarred and weary, was beginning to endure. As he lay in his hammock that night, rocked by the motion of the ship, he whispered again to himself, "I will survive this voyage." But this time the words carried not just fear, but resolve. The storm came like a beast unchained. 4 days, dark clouds had stalked the horizon, heavy and swollen with menace. The air grew thick, the sea restless. Even the most seasoned sailors fell quiet, eyes darting skyward. Then one night the heavens split open. Rain lashed the deck in sheets, driven sideways by screaming winds. The ship heaved and groaned, timbers straining under the assault. Waves towered higher than church steeples, crashing over the bulwarks and sweeping men from their feet. Reef the topsails. The captain's roar was barely audible over the gale. Orders flew, men scrambled like ants, clinging to ropes that felt alive with fury. Jan had climbed the rigging before, but never like this. The mast swayed violently, each movement threatening to fling him into the raging Black Sea. Salt spray stung his eyes, blinding him. His fingers slipped on soaked ropes, raw skin tearing anew. Still he climbed. He had no choice. Disobedience meant flogging or worse, contempt from the crew. Lightning split the sky, a jagged white claw. For an instant, the deck below glowed like daylight. Men hauling lines, others praying, some vomiting with fear. Then darkness swallowed all again. At the topsail, Jan fought the whipping canvas, a monster alive in the wind. He grappled with the rope, his arms trembling, every muscle screaming. A sudden gust ripped the sail free, and the edge of the flapping canvas cracked across his face like a whip. Pain exploded, hot and sharp. Warm blood streamed down his cheek, mingling with rain. He nearly let go. The sea roared beneath, hungry and endless. For a heartbeat, Jan thought he would join the bodies already claimed that night. But then he heard Peter's voice from below, steady and unyielding. "Hold fast, Jan. Hold." Something inside him hardened. Through the pain, through the blinding rain, he tied the reef knot, forcing the sail to heel. His blood mingled with the storm, his body an extension of the ship's will to endure. When the order finally came to descend, Jan slid down the ratlins, his face slick with rain and blood. He hit the deck with a thud, gasping for air. Peter was there instantly, grabbing his arm, steadying him. "Your face," Peter said, eyes narrowing. Jan touched his cheek. His fingers came away crimson. A ragged gash stretched from temple to jaw, raw and burning. The surgeon Jansen appeared, his expression grim. "Hold still," he muttered, pressing a filthy cloth to the wound. Jan bit back a scream as the salt and dirt ground into raw flesh. "You'll live," Jansen said after a time. "But it will scar." The storm raged for 2 more days. Men were lost, washed overboard, swallowed whole without a chance for burial. Each wave seemed determined to tear the ship apart. But the Batavia's pride, battered and weary, held on. When the winds finally eased, the crew staggered across the sodden deck like ghosts, their eyes hollow, their bodies broken but alive. Jan found himself staring at the horizon, trembling. He had faced death, stared into its gaping maw and clawed his way back. The farm boy he had been was gone. In his place stood someone marked, someone the sea had claimed. Cornelis found him later, smirking though his own face was pale. "Nice mark, farm boy. Now you look like the rest of us." The sea leaves its brand on all who survive her storms. Jan touched the wound, now a stiff line of pain across his face. It felt strange, permanent. He hated it, yet at the same time he understood. This scar was proof. Proof that he had faced the sea's fury and lived. That night, when he tried to sleep, his body refused to rest. Each crack of the timbers brought him back to the mast, clinging for life. Each gust of wind made his scar throb. But amid the fear was something else, a grim pride. He had not been broken. Peter sat beside him in the dim lantern light, sharpening a knife with steady strokes. "You did well," he said simply. "Better than many would have." Jan looked at him, surprised by the praise. "I thought I would fall." "You didn't." Peter's tone was matter of fact. "That's what counts. The sea tests us all. You passed your first storm." Jan closed his eyes. "Passed, yes, but not without cost. The scar would never fade. And neither would the memory of the storm's roar, the endless black water reaching up to claim him." But as the ship creaked gently in calmer seas, Jan whispered into the dark, almost in defiance, "I will survive this voyage." And this time the sea seemed to listen. The sea calmed after the storm, but on board the Batavia's pride, another storm brewed, quieter but no less dangerous. Jan noticed it first in whispers passed among the men during the night watch, in the furtive exchanges of small packages, in the way Cornelis disappeared below decks and returned with a smirk in pockets that jingled faintly. At first, Jan thought nothing of it. Sailors always schemed, always sought to ease the hardship of the voyage with small indulgences. But when he caught Cornelis passing a tightly wrapped parcel to another sailor with a glance over his shoulder, Jan's curiosity sharpened. "What was that?" he asked later when they were alone, scrubbing the deck. Cornelis grinned. "A little business, farm boy. Nothing to worry your honest head about." "I thought trade was forbidden," Jan pressed. "It is, unless you're clever." Cornelis lowered his voice. "The company looks the other way for small deals. The trick is not to get greedy. Pepper, nutmeg, cloves, easy to hide, easy to sell in Amsterdam. A handful can pay more than a year's wages. You think any man here slaves for salt pork and a flogging? No, we all play the game." Jan frowned, uneasy. He remembered Johannes in Batavia, warning of the fortunes made by private trade. But to hear it from Cornelis so casually made the whole thing feel dangerous. "And if you're caught?" Cornelis's grin widened. "Then you pray the officer is hungry for his share. Everyone has a price." The words left a bitter taste. That evening, Peter found Jan brooding near the rail. "What troubles you?" he asked. Jan hesitated. Peter's honesty was a rare light aboard ship, one he had come to value. "The men," Jan said finally. "They trade behind the officers' backs." Peter nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Of course they do. You think the company pays enough for this life? For storms, for death, for hunger? No. The only way to make it worthwhile is to carry a little something of your own." "But it's forbidden," Jan protested. Peter turned his gaze on him, calm but sharp. "So is flogging a man to death for stealing a crust of bread. Yet it happens. The company forbids anything that cuts into its profits, but it doesn't care how many sailors rot. You'll learn January. The real rules are not the ones written on paper." The truth unsettled him. He had grown up with clear lines, what was right, what was wrong. Here everything blurred. Survival demanded compromise, cunning, even betrayal. The test came sooner than he expected. One night, as Jan returned from watch, Cornelis beckoned him into the shadows of the hold. "Help me shift this crate," Cornelis whispered. Together they levered the heavy box aside, revealing a hollow space beneath the planks. Inside, wrapped in canvas, were small bundles of peppercorns, the dark seeds spilling like treasure when Cornelis loosened the cloth. Jan stared. The smell was sharp, intoxicating. "Take some," Cornelis urged. "No one will miss it. A handful of this could buy your mother a cow back in Holland. You've worked like a dog for months. Don't you deserve more than blisters?" Jan's hand hovered over the bundle. The thought of returning home with real profit was tempting, painfully so. But the image of the canvas-wrapped body sliding into the sea came unbidden to his mind. Men lost, nameless, forgotten. Would he betray himself for a handful of spice? "No," Jan said firmly, stepping back. Cornelis's grin faded. "Suit yourself, farm boy. But don't say I didn't offer." His eyes glinted, amusement mixed with something darker. "One day you'll learn that honesty doesn't keep you alive." The moment left Jan shaken. He felt caught between two worlds, Peter's quiet honor and Cornelis's ruthless cunning. Which path was right? Which path would keep him alive? Days later, the matter became more dangerous. An officer discovered contraband hidden in a sailor's hammock, cloves wrapped in a rag. The sailor was dragged on deck, stripped to the waist and tied to the grating. The boatswain's mate laid into him with the cat-o'-nine-tails until his back was a ruin of blood and welts. The crew watched in silence, horror etched into every face. Cornelis leaned close to Jan, voice a whisper. "That's the price if you're careless. Remember it." Jan could not look away. He understood now. The sea tested more than endurance. It tested loyalty, morality, even one's very soul. To survive meant choosing between right and wrong, between honor and betrayal, between what the company demanded and what the sailors needed. As the flogged man was carried below, unconscious and broken, Jan whispered to himself again. But this time the words trembled. "I will survive this voyage." And for the first time he wondered what surviving might cost. The flogging changed everything. Men who had once grumbled quietly now whispered with anger. The sight of their shipmate's blood pooling on the deck, his back torn raw for a handful of cloves, lodged in their minds like a splinter. They had endured hunger, disease, storms, but cruelty from their own masters was different. It left a wound that festered in silence. Jan felt it in the air, heavy as the humid winds near the equator. Sailors' eyes flicked to officers with barely concealed hatred. Orders were obeyed but grudgingly. Laughter in the forecastle dwindled. Even the songs sung at night, rough sea shanties meant to lift spirits, grew fewer. Cornelis was at the center of it. Jan often caught him speaking in low tones to groups of sailors, always in the corners of the deck, out of the officer's sight. His grin was sharper now, his words carrying the edge of persuasion. "They starve us while they dine on fresh meat," Cornelis whispered one night as Jan passed by. "They beat us for a handful of spice, while their cabins overflow with silks and porcelain. And for what? A pittance of wages if we live to see them." Jan wanted to walk past, to ignore the poison in Cornelis's words. But the men listening leaned closer, their faces grim, their fists clenched. The seed of rebellion was sprouting. Later, Jan confronted him. "You'll get men killed," he hissed. Cornelis only smirked. "Men are already dying, farm boy. Better to die with a blade in your hand than under the lash." Peter overheard. His expression hardened. "Enough," he said to Cornelis. "Talk of mutiny gets men hanged at the yardarm." Cornelis shrugged. "And talk of obedience gets men whipped to death. Pick your poison." He melted into the shadows before Peter could retort. For days, tension coiled tighter. The officers noticed but mistook it for fatigue. Only Captain Van Donk seemed aware of the danger. He prowled the deck with a hand always near his sword, his eyes cold and sharp. The breaking point came over food. The sailor's biscuit ration was crawling with maggots, black with rot. When one man spat his out in disgust and refused to eat, the boatswain's mate struck him across the jaw with a belaying pin. The man crumpled, blood pouring from his mouth. That night, whispers became shouts. In the forecastle, men argued openly. "Enough. We won't be treated like dogs," one shouted. Another snarled, "If we rise now, we can take the ship." Jan sat in the corner, heart pounding. He had no wish to see men slaughtered. He had no desire to stand against armed officers with only knives and belaying pins. But he could feel the pull of the crowd, the heat of their rage. Peter stood slowly, his presence commanding silence. "Listen well," he said. "I've seen mutinies. They end the same way, blood on the deck, bodies swinging from the yardarms. You want to die screaming, go ahead. But don't drag the rest of us down with you." The men grumbled, some swayed by his authority, others still seething. Cornelis's eyes glittered in the dim lantern light. "Fear keeps you chained, old man. I'd rather gamble for freedom than lick the boots of tyrants." "Then gamble alone," Peter shot back. His voice was steady as stone. The tension broke not with knives but with silence. The men drifted into uneasy sleep, their anger unresolved, their rebellion smothered but not extinguished. The next day, Captain Van Donk addressed the crew on deck. His words were brief, but his tone like iron. "I hear whispers," he said, voice carrying over the creak of the rigging. "I hear grumbling about food, about discipline. Let me remind you, this ship is company property. You are company men. Defy me and you defy the company. The punishment for mutiny is death. Quick if you're lucky." His eyes swept the crew. For a heartbeat, Jan thought Cornelis might step forward, might challenge him then and there. But Cornelis only smiled faintly, as though storing the threat away for another day. The captain's presence cowed the men for now. Work resumed, but the silence was thicker than before, the glances darker. That night, as Jan lay awake in his hammock, Peter spoke softly beside him. "You see it, don't you? The sea is dangerous enough without fighting ourselves. But it will come again, January. One day the lash will be the spark and no speech will smother it." Jan said nothing. He knew Peter was right. The storm outside had passed, but another storm, silent, human, and just as deadly, still brewed beneath the deck. It began with a cough. At first, no one thought much of it. Sailors always coughed. Dust from the biscuit, salt from the sea, the endless damp that settled in the lungs. But within days, the cough deepened. Men wheezed through the night, their breaths ragged, their bodies trembling with fever. Soon the lower deck stank of sickness. Sweat, vomit, and the sour stink of rotting gums. The surgeon Jansen moved among the hammocks, his face gray with exhaustion. He applied poultices, bled men with rusty instruments, muttered prayers. But nothing slowed the fever. Jan watched in horror as strong men dwindled into husks within days. Their skin burned hot, then chilled cold. Their eyes glazed over, their lips cracked. Some raved in delirium, shouting for wives or mothers long dead. Others simply went quiet and never woke again. The first body was carried up and dropped into the sea without ceremony. The officers had no stomach for long burials when death stalked the ship daily. Then another and another. Canvas and shot, prayers and splash. The ocean swallowed them all. Jan did his best to stay alive. He scrubbed his hammock with seawater, rationed his biscuit, forced himself to drink even when the water turned sour. But the fear crept in at night. Every cough from the man swinging above him sounded like doom. Every fevered groan made his chest tighten with dread. One evening, Cornelis collapsed beside the galley fire, his forehead blazing hot. Jan and Peter dragged him to his hammock, though Cornelis cursed them even in his weakness. "Don't waste time, farm boy," he rasped. "Save yourself." Peter forced him down. "Shut your mouth. You're not dying yet." 4 days, Jan tended Cornelis as best he could, wiping sweat from his brow, forcing spoonfuls of thin broth past his lips. He did it grudgingly, torn between contempt for Cornelis's ruthless ways and the stubborn loyalty that hardship breeds among sailors. "Why?" Cornelis croaked one night, eyes sunken but sharp. "You could let me die. One less rival for wages and spoils." "Because I'm not like you," Jan said simply. Cornelis laughed weakly, the sound like a broken cough. "Then you'll never be rich, farm boy. But maybe you'll outlive us all." His eyes closed, and for a moment Jan thought he was gone. But Cornelis clung stubbornly to life as always. The fever raged across the crew. Watches grew thin, sails went untended, ropes frayed from neglect. Only fear of the officer's lash kept the ship running at all. Jan found himself working double, even triple shifts, scrubbing decks 1 hour, hauling lines the next, then carrying buckets of foul water from the sickbay. His body screamed for rest, but rest was a luxury no one could afford. One night, fire broke out in the galley. A spark from the stove caught on the tarred ropes stacked nearby. In moments, flames licked up the bulkheads, smoke filling the air. Panic erupted. Half the healthy men were too weak from fever to fight the blaze. Jan seized a bucket and joined the line, his arms trembling as he hauled seawater up from the deck pump. The fire roared, hungry, threatening to consume the ship. Sparks rained down, searing skin, catching in hair. "Faster!" an officer bellowed, his voice hoarse with fear. Jan flung water until his hands blistered. His eyes stung, his lungs burned with smoke. At last, with a final desperate surge, the flames sputtered and died, leaving the galley blackened and reeking of charred wood. Men collapsed where they stood, too weak to cheer. The ship still floated, but barely. That night, lying in his hammock, Jan's body quaked with exhaustion. His scar throbbed from the heat of the fire. He felt sickness pressing close, like an invisible wave ready to drag him under. But he clung to one thought: endure. He had survived the storm. He had survived the lash. He would survive this too. Peter sat nearby, his face lined with weariness but steady as always. "You fought well today," he said quietly. Jan shook his head. "I thought we'd all burn." Peter gave a tired half-smile. "The sea kills in 100 ways. But not tonight. Tonight you lived." And as the ship rocked gently under the stars, Jan whispered once more, his voice raw but unbroken, "I will survive this voyage." The fever eased after weeks, but its shadow lingered. A third of the crew lay beneath the waves, stitched in canvas. The survivors were gaunt, hollow-eyed, their minds as scarred as their bodies. Jan felt it in every creak of the timbers, in every hollow footstep across the deck. The ship was different now. The songs were gone. Even curses had grown faint, muttered without conviction. Men moved like ghosts, obeying orders with blank eyes. Some, though, cracked under the strain. One night, a sailor named Willem began to scream in his hammock. He clawed at the air as though fighting invisible ropes, shouting of storms and drowning. When men tried to hold him down, he bit one of them, blood streaming down the man's arm. Willem was dragged on deck, raving, until the captain ordered him bound to the mast until his madness passed. It never did. 3 days later, Willem died, eyes staring, still muttering of black water. Others broke in quieter ways. One man refused to eat, pushing away the biscuit and pork until his body withered. Another spent hours scratching at the planks as though trying to dig a tunnel through the ship itself. The surgeon could do nothing. "The mind goes where the body cannot follow," he said grimly. Jan clung to sanity by sheer will. He forced himself into the rhythm of work, focusing on rope, on wood, on the endless tasks that kept the ship alive. He listened to Peter's calm voice, steady as a lighthouse, a reminder of order in chaos. And when nightmares woke him, when he saw again the storm and felt the sting of his scar, he whispered his mantra, "I will survive this voyage." Cornelis, pale but alive after his fever, grew sharper than ever. He watched the unraveling of the crew with eyes that gleamed. "Weakness," he muttered one night, nodding toward the men who sat rocking silently in the forecastle. "The sea strips men bare. Only the ruthless endure." "You were nearly gone yourself," Jan shot back. Cornelis smirked. "Nearly. But I didn't die, did I? That's the difference. I know how to cling even when the sea claws at me." Jan hated him for it, yet envied him too. Cornelis seemed unbreakable, his spirit twisted but unyielding. Then came the hunger. Supplies had spoiled faster than expected. Worms infested the biscuit, salt pork rotted in its barrels. The officers still dined decently, but the sailors' rations shrank until they were gnawing on hardtack black with mold. Some scraped the maggots off, others ate them for the extra protein. Jan forced himself to chew, ignoring the bile that rose in his throat. It was during this time that the first whispers of cannibalism surfaced. Not serious, not yet, just muttered jests in the dark, nervous laughter when bellies growled too loudly. But Jan saw the way men eyed the weakest among them, their gazes lingering too long. The officers tried to keep discipline, but their own fear showed in their eyes. One night, Captain Van Donk stormed into the forecastle, sword at his side. "You will hold fast," he barked. "We are company men, not beasts. Anyone caught breaking discipline will be flogged to death." The threat rang hollow. The lash could frighten men into silence, but not into sanity. That same night, Jan found himself on deck, staring at the dark horizon. The sea stretched endless, a prison with no walls. For the first time he wondered if Peter was wrong, that perhaps mutiny, even bloodshed, was better than waiting for slow death. Peter joined him, silent for a time. Then he said softly, "You feel it too? The edge?" Jan nodded. "I don't know how much longer the men can last." Peter's gaze was steady. "The sea always pushes men to the edge. The question is, do you fall or do you learn to live there?" Jan touched his scar, the mark the sea had already given him. He wondered how many more marks he could endure. Below decks, the whispers continued. Men laughed without humor, eyes gleaming with hunger. The air was thick with madness, as if the sea itself had seeped into their minds, whispering promises of release. Jan closed his eyes and gripped the rail until his knuckles whitened. "I will survive this voyage," he whispered again. But now, the words trembled as though survival meant becoming something less than human. After weeks of storms and fever, the sea gave them something worse: stillness. The sails hung limp against the masts, useless rags in the breathless air. The sea stretched flat as polished glass, a mirror reflecting a blazing sun that baked the deck until the pitch oozed between the planks. The Batavia's pride drifted, becalmed, her crew trapped in a silent, airless prison. At first, the men welcomed the calm. No waves to fight, no storms to endure. But soon the stillness became unbearable. Sweat soaked their clothes by dawn, and by noon the heat pressed like a hand upon their throats. The barrels of water grew warm and rank. Meat spoiled faster in the heat. The air below decks was suffocating, filled with the reek of unwashed bodies and sickness. Jan found himself moving slower each day, his strength leaching away with every hour of sun. Even the officers' tempers frayed. Orders were barked without conviction, punishments delivered with more cruelty than usual. The worst was the thirst. Water was rationed to a cup a day, warm and foul-tasting. Men fought over drops spilled on the deck. One sailor tried to sneak an extra sip from a barrel and was caught. The boatswain's mate beat him senseless, leaving him half dead. Cornelis sat in the shade of the mainmast, lips cracked, eyes burning with a feverish gleam. This is how the sea kills, farm boy. Not with storms, not with shot or steel, but with waiting. Waiting until you're too weak to fight. Jan ignored him, though the truth of his words gnawed inside. He remembered the green fields of home, the cool stream by his father's farm. To think of such things was torture, yet his mind returned to them again and again, as if thirst alone could conjure water. Madness crept back among the men. Some stripped naked and leapt overboard, convinced they could drink the sea itself. They surfaced choking, their mouths full of salt water, and sank before help could reach them. Others sat muttering prayers, rocking back and forth like broken children. Peter alone seemed steady. He moved carefully, conserving energy, guiding Jan when he faltered. "One breath at a time," he murmured. "One step, then another. Don't think of tomorrow. Just today." But even Peter's strength had limits. Jan saw the hollows deepen in his cheeks, the tremor in his hands when he lifted his cup of water. Days passed with no wind. The sun blazed, the sea shimmered, the horizon unchanging. The ship felt like a coffin drifting on an endless mirror. Then came the fight. Two men quarreled over a scrap of biscuit dropped on the deck. Voices rose, curses flew, and suddenly knives flashed. The crew circled, too weak to intervene but too desperate to stop watching. The men slashed at each other with ragged fury until one fell, blood dark against the sun-bleached planks. No officer interfered. The captain stood at the quarterdeck, silent, as though acknowledging the futility of law in such conditions. The dead man was heaved overboard without ceremony. The survivor licked blood from his cracked lips, eyes wild. That night, Jan lay in his hammock, too parched to sleep. He whispered his vow again, but his voice was a rasp. "I will survive this voyage." Yet doubt gnawed at him. How much more could his body endure? On the fifth morning, a cry went up from the masthead. A cloud. A breeze. Jan stumbled on deck to see it. A faint ripple on the horizon, a dark smudge of cloud promising rain. The crew surged with sudden life, dragging buckets, spreading canvas sheets. Hours later, the first drops fell, cool and pure, splashing across blistered skin. Men laughed and wept, opening their mouths to the sky, catching water in cupped hands. The sails filled at last with a whisper of wind. The Batavia's pride creaked forward, sluggish but alive. The doldrums had broken. That night, as the ship moved once more, Jan sat on deck with Peter, rainwater dripping from his hair. "I thought we would all die," Jan confessed. Peter gave a faint smile. "We nearly did, but you held on. That's all the sea asks." Jan touched the scar on his face, feeling the raised line beneath his fingers. He was thinner now, weaker, but still alive. The sea had tested him again, and though it stripped him bare, it had not taken him. For now. The call came from the lookout. "Cape ahead." Jan climbed to the deck rail and squinted. Far to the south, jagged peaks loomed, black against a furious sky. The Cape of Good Hope. Sailors called it by another name, the Cape of Storms. The graveyard of ships. The weather turned almost at once. A hard wind roared in from the southwest, whipping the sea into mountains. The Batavia's pride groaned, her timbers shuddering as waves smashed against her hull. Spray blasted across the deck, stinging like ice despite the summer season. "Reef the sails." The captain's voice boomed above the gale. Jan scrambled into the rigging with the others. The mast swung wildly, pitching him from side to side. His scar throbbed with each gust. He forced numb fingers to tie knots as the canvas snapped like cannon fire. Below, the sea rose higher. Waves slammed across the deck, sweeping men from their feet. One sailor vanished over the side with a scream swallowed instantly by the wind. No one dared pause to mourn. The sea gave no time for grief. For 3 days they fought the Cape. The ship was thrown like a toy, her bow plunging into troughs so deep Jan thought they'd never rise again. Rain fell in sheets, driven sideways, blinding them. The air reeked of salt and fear. On the second night, the mainmast cracked with a sound like thunder. Jan clung to the shrouds as splinters rained down. "Brace it," the bosun roared. Men swarmed with ropes, lashing the wounded mast. Jan worked beside Peter, their hands moving in grim rhythm, binding wood against the fury of the sea. "Hold, you bastard," Peter muttered to the mast as though speaking to a wounded comrade. And somehow the mast held. But not all men did. On the third morning, Cornelis collapsed on the deck, too weak to rise. Jan dragged him beneath the shelter of the bulwark. Cornelis's lips were blue, his breath ragged. This is it, farm boy," he gasped. "No," Jan growled, gripping his arm. "Get up." Cornelis coughed, then laughed weakly. "Still too honest for your own good." Jan hauled him to his feet, half carrying him until the storm slackened enough for him to collapse safely in the forecastle. Even now, Jan couldn't abandon him. Perhaps that was weakness. Perhaps it was strength. By the fourth day the storm broke. The sun pierced through ragged clouds, casting golden light over a sea still heaving with monstrous swells. The crew staggered like men reborn, faces hollow but alive. They had passed the cape. Jan leaned against the rail, chest heaving, watching Albatross wheel above the foam. He felt more dead than living, but his heart beat on. The farm boy who had once feared the lash was long gone. What remained was something forged by storm, scar, and suffering. Peter stood beside him, beard dripping with salt water. "You'll never forget this," he said quietly. "I never want to see it again," Jan admitted. Peter's eyes held a glint of something more. "And yet you will. Once the sea brands you, she calls you back again and again." Jan said nothing. He only touched his scar, still raw from salt and wind, and stared at the endless horizon. The Cape had tested them all and many had failed. But he had survived. That night, when the crew gathered for the first meal without rain soaking their bread, Captain Van Donk addressed them. His voice was flat, but beneath it pulsed rare respect. "You've seen the Cape," he said, "and you've lived. That is no small thing. Remember it. Few men can say the same." The men ate in silence, their faces pale lanterns in the lamplight. Some stared at their food as though it were a stranger. Others muttered brief thanks to God. Jan simply chewed and swallowed, too exhausted for words. When he finally collapsed into his hammock, rocked by the gentler swells of calmer seas, Jan whispered again, "I will survive this voyage." But this time it was not a vow. It was a truth. After the fury of the Cape, the seas felt merciful. The wind steadied into a strong westerly, carrying the Batavia's pride northward. The worst was behind them, or so the men whispered, though none dared say it too loudly, for fear the sea might hear and take offense. The ship was battered but afloat. Sails patched, masts scarred, decks stained with blood and tar. The survivors moved like shadows, gaunt from fever and hunger, but with a spark in their eyes that had not been there before. They had endured the Cape of Storms, the sea's harshest trial. For sailors, that was almost a rebirth. Jan felt it too. At night, rocked in his hammock, he found himself dreaming not of storms or sickness, but of home. He saw the green meadows of Holland, the low stone farmhouse, his mother's bread steaming fresh on the table. He could almost taste the cool water from the village well. "Dreaming again, farm boy?" Cornelis muttered one evening, his voice rough but alive. He had regained some strength since the Cape, though his eyes still held that feverish gleam. "Of home," Jan admitted. Cornelis spat over the side. "Don't waste your mind on what's gone. The sea changes you. You'll step off that ship and find the land doesn't fit anymore. Too quiet. Too small." Jan frowned. "And you? Will you never go back?" Cornelis laughed, a sound more bitter than mirthful. "Back to what? A tavern in Rotterdam that wouldn't know me if I walked through the door? No, farm boy. My home is here." He slapped the damp rail. "This cursed deck under my feet." The words unsettled January. He wanted to believe in return, in reunion, in home. Yet in the quiet hours, when the sea stretched endless and stars wheeled above, Cornelis's words gnawed at him. What if the sea had already claimed him, body and soul? Peter sensed his turmoil. One night, as Jan stood watch, staring at the horizon, Peter joined him. "You're thinking of home?" he said, not a question. "Yes," Jan admitted. "But Cornelis says, he says men like us never truly return." Peter was silent for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable in the moonlight. At last he said, "Cornelis is half right. The sea brands us. We return changed, scarred, restless. But that doesn't mean there is no home. It means home must bend just as we bend." Jan considered this, letting the words settle. He touched the scar on his cheek, still rough beneath his fingers. "And if home doesn't bend?" Peter's eyes flicked to the stars. "Then you find another. Every man must anchor somewhere, January. Even sailors." The days stretched on. The air grew cooler as they sailed north, a sharp relief after the choking heat of the doldrums. Gulls began to appear, circling overhead, a sign of land not too far distant. Each feathered wing was like a promise whispered into the wind. The crew began to talk more freely now. In hushed tones, they spoke of wives and sweethearts, of taverns in Amsterdam where ale flowed freely, of debts to be paid and fortunes to be made. Even the officers relaxed slightly, their curses carrying less venom. The shadow of death still lingered, but hope had returned, faint but stubborn. Jan kept to himself, yet he could not keep the images of home from rising. He imagined his father's stern face softening. Would it after all this time? He imagined his brothers taller, stronger, staring in awe at the scar across his cheek. He imagined his sister no longer a child, but a young woman asking endless questions about faraway seas. And always he imagined his mother's embrace. The thought alone was enough to steady him when exhaustion threatened to drag him under. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Cornelis leaned against the rail, grinning faintly. "You really believe they'll welcome you back, don't you?" Jan said nothing. Cornelis chuckled. "You'll see. They'll look at you, scarred, lean, with the stink of tar and salt. And they'll know you're not theirs anymore. You're the sea's." Jan turned sharply, anger rising. But before he could speak, Peter's voice cut in. "Enough." He stepped between them, his gaze hard on Cornelis. "Let the boy keep his hope. The sea will take it soon enough if it must." Cornelis smirked, but fell silent. That night, Jan lay in his hammock, staring into the dark. Cornelis's words stung, but Peter steadied him. Perhaps hope was fragile, but it was his. And until the ship docked and he stepped onto Dutch soil once more, he would cling to it. The winds carried them northward, steady and sure. The stars wheeled, the gulls cried, and for the first time since leaving Amsterdam, Jan felt something like certainty. Home was ahead. Whether it still wanted him or not, that was a question for another day. The closer they sailed to Europe, the louder the whispers of profit became. Amsterdam loomed ahead, not yet on the horizon, but in every man's mind. Wages would be paid, debts settled, taverns visited. Yet for most, the wages were meager, already promised away to creditors and kin. Real wealth, everyone knew, came not from pay but from private trade. Jan still carried the small cloth bag hidden deep in his sea chest, the nutmeg and cloves bought in Batavia with his meager savings. He had kept it close through storm, fever, and hunger. Now, as the ship neared home, its weight seemed heavier than gold. Cornelis noticed, of course. He always noticed. One evening, as they scrubbed the deck, he leaned close, his voice low. "You've been guarding something. Don't deny it. I've seen the way you check your chest at night." Jan stiffened. "It's nothing." Cornelis smirked. "Nothing that you'd sew a secret pocket for? Don't be a fool, farm boy. You think you're the only one with contraband aboard? Half the men have pepper tucked in their hammocks, or silk stitched into their shirts. The company knows it. The trick is slipping past their dogs in Amsterdam." Jan's pulse quickened. "And if they catch us? Then you lose everything. Maybe a flogging. Maybe prison. Depends on the inspector's mood." Cornelis's grin widened. "Unless, of course, you know how to bargain." The thought chilled January. He had survived storms and disease. Would he now risk ruin for a handful of spice? Yet when he thought of home, of facing his father with empty hands, shame tightened his chest. He had to try. Peter, when Jan confided in him, frowned deeply. "Smuggling is a dangerous game. The company tolerates small things, but only if you're careful. One mistake and you'll pay dearly." "I can't return with nothing," Jan said quietly. "I need to show them something. That I didn't suffer for nothing." Peter studied him a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then hide it well. And when the time comes, sell quickly, quietly. Don't get greedy." The days passed in tense anticipation. The wind carried them swiftly north. The sea grew colder, the air sharp with winter. Soon, gulls circled overhead and other ships appeared on the horizon. Europe. Civilization. The end of the voyage. The crew buzzed with nervous energy. Some gambled away their wages before they even reached port. Others sharpened knives, ready to defend their goods against thieves. Cornelis moved among them like a shadow, always smiling, always scheming. The night before landfall, Jan sat in the forecastle, turning the small bag over in his hands. The smell of nutmeg filled the air, sharp and sweet. It was all he had, all his suffering, his scar, his nightmares, reduced to this fragile prize. Cornelis slid onto the bench beside him. "So it's true," he murmured, eyeing the bag. "Not bad for a first voyage. That might fetch you a tidy sum." Jan tucked it back into his pocket. "I don't need your help." Cornelis chuckled. "Everyone needs help, farm boy, especially when the inspectors come aboard. Lucky for you, I know which ones like their palms greased. Stick close to me in Amsterdam, and you might just walk away with your little treasure." Jan hesitated. He hated trusting Cornelis, but he hated the thought of failure more. The next morning, Amsterdam rose from the mist. Church spires and windmills pierced the gray sky, the harbor crowded with ships. The smell of land, smoke, bread, horses, swept over the deck, dizzying after months at sea. As the Batavia's pride docked, company inspectors climbed aboard, sharp-eyed and stern. They moved through the ship like hounds, sniffing for contraband. Men stood tense, chests tight, pockets bulging with hidden goods. Jan's turn came. His sea chest was opened, inspected. His spare shirt lifted, his worn boots shaken. The inspector's hand brushed dangerously close to the hidden pocket. Jan's heart pounded, his scar burning as if it knew the noose hovered near. Then Cornelis stepped forward, smiling sly. "Inspector," he said smoothly, slipping a small pouch of coins into the man's hand. "No need to waste time here. The farm boy's clean." The inspector's eyes gleamed. He closed the chest with a snap. "Very well. Next." Jan exhaled, weak with relief. The bag of nutmeg and cloves still pressed against his ribs, unseen. As the crew disembarked, Cornelis clapped him on the shoulder. "You see, farm boy? The sea takes much, but if you're clever, it gives something back. Now let's find a buyer." Jan said nothing, but deep inside he knew this was only the beginning of another kind of danger, the kind that waited not in storms or sickness, but in the alleys and taverns of Amsterdam. For now, though, he had survived, and his prize, small but precious, was still his. The gangplank clattered against the dock, and for the first time in more than a year, Jan stepped onto solid ground. It felt strange, steady, unyielding, almost alien after months of shifting decks and rolling seas. His legs wobbled as though the earth itself were moving beneath him. Around him, the harbor was alive with sound. Dockworkers shouted as they hauled cargo. Carts rattled across cobblestones. Church bells tolled from the spires of Amsterdam. And everywhere the smell, smoke from chimneys, fresh bread from bakeries, horses, fish. Jan inhaled deeply, dizzy with the richness of it. Cornelis elbowed him. "Feels good, doesn't it, farm boy? Like being reborn." Jan nodded wordlessly. He was too overwhelmed to speak. The noise, the smells, the sheer press of humanity after so long at sea, his senses reeled. Their first stop was a tavern 3 streets back from the docks. It was close enough to smell of tar and brine, but far enough that the patrons were mostly sailors instead of cutthroats. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and laughter. The ceiling was low, the walls scarred with decades of tankards slammed in anger or joy. Cornelis slapped coins on the counter. "Beer. 2 mugs. And make it full, not that watered swill you serve dock rats." Moments later, foaming mugs arrived. Jan raised his with trembling hands. The first mouthful was a revelation, dark, bitter, alive with flavor. After months of stale water and sour grog, it was like tasting life itself. "To survival," Cornelis declared, raising his mug. "And to those who didn't," Jan added quietly. They clinked and drank. For a long moment, silence fell between them, both lost in memory of the canvas-wrapped bodies sliding into the sea. Soon, food arrived, bread still warm, cheese sharp and fresh, salted herring glistening on a wooden board. Jan ate like a starving man, every bite a miracle. He chewed slowly at first, savoring each flavor, then faster, as if afraid it would vanish. "You eat like it'll be taken from you," Cornelis observed. Jan froze, bread halfway to his mouth. "Habit," he admitted. Cornelis smirked. "It never leaves. Even after 10 voyages, you'll still guard your plate." When the mugs were drained and the food gone, Cornelis leaned close. "Now for business. I know a broker, Isaac, name you don't forget. He's fair for a thief. Won't cheat you worse than the others. We'll see him tomorrow. Tonight we drink." Jan agreed, though unease tugged at him. He had survived storms and sickness, but the streets of Amsterdam had their own dangers. Still, he followed Cornelis into the city. The night was alive with freedom. Lanterns glowed along the canals. Women leaned from doorways, calling in lilting voices. Sailors sang off-key, staggering arm in arm. Every tavern spilled laughter and smoke into the streets. Jan wandered in a daze, marveling at the noise, the light, the sheer abundance. He felt like a man stepping from a grave into a carnival. Yet beneath the joy was an ache he could not ignore. The memory of his family's farm, the quiet fields, the simple rhythm of land. The city was dazzling, but it was not home. In a quieter tavern near the east gate, Cornelis bought them another round. The beer here was stronger, the patrons rougher. Fights broke out in the corner, but no one paid them much heed. "So," Cornelis said, leaning back with a grin, "what will you do, farm boy, when you've sold your little bag of spice? Run back to your cows and chickens?" Jan bristled. "Maybe. It's my home." Cornelis laughed, sharp and bitter. "Home? We'll see. You'll go back and the farm will feel small, the fields too quiet. You'll miss the sea before the plow even bites the earth." Jan stared into his mug, uncertain. Cornelis's words carried too much truth. Later, when Jan stumbled into a lodging house, coins clutched in his fist, he collapsed into a bed that felt impossibly soft after a year on planks. The mattress sagged, the blanket scratched, but to him it was luxury beyond measure. He lay staring at the low ceiling, the sounds of the city muffled beyond the shutters. His hand brushed the hidden pocket where the spices lay. Still safe, still his. Tomorrow he would sell. Tomorrow he would face Amsterdam as a man who had endured. But tonight, as sleep claimed him, Jan felt only wonder. He had survived the sea, and for the first time in months he slept without fear. Morning in Amsterdam was harsher than Jan remembered. The streets stank of fish, horses, and unwashed crowds. Merchants shouted prices, carts rumbled over cobblestones, church bells tolled through the mist. After months of sea silence, the clamor was almost overwhelming. Cornelis led the way, weaving confidently through narrow alleys and canal-side markets. His grin was sharp, his eyes always watching. "Keep your hand on your purse," he warned. "Amsterdam thieves are worse than pirates. At least pirates use a blade." They stopped before a nondescript door in a row of plain brick houses near the Jewish quarter. No sign marked it as a place of trade. Cornelis knocked in a particular rhythm. 3 sharp raps, a pause, then 2 more. The door creaked open. A thin man with a neatly trimmed beard and shrewd eyes stood within. He looked Jan over in one glance and dismissed him. "Cornelis," the man said. "Back from the east again?" Cornelis smiled. "Alive, Isaac, and with business." He gestured toward January. "This one's a first-timer. Brought a little something worth your attention." Isaac ushered them inside. The room was bare save for a large table, a few stools, and shelves lined with small wooden boxes. The air was heavy with fragrance, pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg. Jan's nose tingled, his stomach growling at the memory of exotic markets in Batavia. "Well?" Isaac said briskly. "Let's see it." Jan hesitated, his hand resting on his pocket. The weight of the little cloth bag felt enormous. Everything he had endured, the storm, the fever, the lash, was bound up in that small prize. Peter's warning echoed in his mind, "Don't get greedy." Slowly, Jan drew out the bundle. He unwrapped it to reveal the wrinkled nutmeg and cloves. The smell filled the room instantly, sharp and rich. Isaac leaned in, pinching one nutmeg between long fingers. He sniffed, scraped it with a knife, tasted the powder. His face betrayed nothing. "Quality is fair," he said at last. "Not the best, not the worst. Quantity is small." He named a price, low, insultingly so. Jan's heart sank. "That's barely more than my wages," he protested. Cornelis shot him a warning glance. "Careful, farm boy." Isaac's eyes narrowed. "You think I'd cheat you? The company guards its monopoly well. If I'm caught with contraband, I hang. My risk is greater than yours. Take the price or try your luck elsewhere." The tension in the room thickened. Jan's hand clenched around the bag. He thought of throwing it back in his chest, of walking out. But he saw the truth in Isaac's calm eyes. This man had all the power. Cornelis leaned close, muttering, "Better to walk away with a few coins than nothing. Trust me." Reluctantly, Jan nodded. "Agreed." Isaac smiled thinly. He opened a drawer, counted out coins with deliberate slowness. Each clink of silver on the table was a strange mix of victory and loss. Jan scooped them into his palm, the weight comforting yet disappointing. "Pleasure," Isaac said, already turning to the next matter on his shelves. Outside, Jan stared at the coins, his throat tight. "That was robbery." Cornelis laughed. "Robbery is when they take your goods and give you nothing. This is trade. Welcome to Amsterdam." Jan wanted to throw the coins into the canal. But then he remembered his father's farm, his mother's weary hands, his brother's wide eyes. Even this small sum was better than returning empty. "Spend it wisely," Cornelis said, clapping his shoulder. A few nights of ale and women and it'll vanish. Or hold on to it, and you'll have enough to keep you fed until the next voyage. Jan looked at him sharply. And what about you? Another ship already? Cornelis's grin widened. Always. The sea doesn't let go, farm boy. Not once she's had your blood. As they walked back toward the harbor, Jan's fingers closed around the coins. They were heavy but not enough. Not nearly enough for what he had endured. Yet they were proof. Proof that he had survived, proof that he had brought something back. That night, lying in the narrow bed of the lodging house, Jan turned the coins over one by one, listening to their clink. Not riches, not fortune, but a beginning. And in his heart he knew this, he would sail again. The journey south from Amsterdam felt stranger than the sea voyage itself. Jan traveled not by ship but by wagon, perched atop sacks of grain bound for market. The wheels creaked, horses snorted, and the muddy road stretched endlessly ahead. Compared to the vastness of the ocean, the Dutch countryside seemed small, almost fragile. Windmills turned slowly in the damp breeze, cows grazed in familiar meadows, and canals reflected the pale northern sky. Yet Jan's heart thudded with a nervousness that storms and gunfire had never roused. He was returning to the place he had fled, the farm. He wondered if his father would shut the door in his face, or if his brothers would even recognize him after more than a year away. His mother's face haunted him most. Would she still weep when she thought of him? Or had she grown hardened against disappointment? The wagon dropped him at a crossroads near the village. Jan shouldered his sea chest, the weight of rope-burned memories dragging at every step. As he walked, landmarks returned to him. The stream where he once fished with his brothers, the meadow where he'd worked summers in the hay, the small church whose bells had marked every Sunday of his childhood. All of it unchanged, yet altered through the eyes of a man who had crossed oceans. At last, the farmhouse came into view, smoke curling from its chimney. The sight made his knees weaken. He stopped at the edge of the yard, uncertain. Before he could decide what to do, the door opened. His mother stepped out, a basket of washing in her arms. She looked older, streaks of gray in her hair, lines etched deep around her eyes. She bent to hang a sheet on the line, then turned and froze. The basket dropped. "Jan," she whispered, her voice trembling. He swallowed hard. "Hello, Mother." She ran to him, arms strong despite years of labor. She smelled of bread and herbs and the earth itself. Tears wet his shirt as she clutched him. "We thought you lost. So many ships." Her words broke, replaced by sobs. Guilt and relief surged in him. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I should have written. I should have." She silenced him with her touch, fingers tracing the scar across his face. "What happened to you? It's a long story." "Then you'll tell it over supper," she said firmly, practical even in her joy. "Your father is in the field. The boys are helping with the calf. Come." Inside, the kitchen was exactly as he remembered, the scrubbed wooden table, crockery on shelves, herbs hanging from rafters. Yet everything felt smaller, as though his time at sea had stretched him beyond the boundaries of this modest life. The door creaked again. His father entered, shoulders stooped, beard more gray than brown. His gaze fell on Jan, unreadable. Behind him crowded Jan's siblings. 2 brothers taller than before, a sister grown from child to young woman. Jan stood uncertain. "Father," he said, his voice hoarse. His father studied him for a long moment. "Then you've come back." "Yes," Jan said quietly. "The sea didn't want me." For the first time, his father's expression softened, not quite a smile but a shift. "You look half-starved. Sit. Eat." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acceptance. Jan sat, heart pounding with gratitude. His family gathered, staring as though he were a ghost come home. The meal was simple: bread, cheese, smoked meat, but after salt pork and worm-riddled biscuit, it tasted like a royal feast. Jan ate slowly, savoring every bite. His siblings peppered him with questions about storms, battles, strange animals, and foreign lands. His mother fussed with practical matters: what he ate, where he slept, how he kept his clothes mended. His father asked little but listened intently. When Jan finished a tale about Batavia's gardens, his father finally spoke. "And now, what will you do?" The question hung heavy. Jan stared at the table. The farm was familiar, comforting but confining. The sea, dangerous and cruel, still called to him. "I thought perhaps," he said carefully. "I might stay for a while. If I'm welcome." His father's gaze pinned him. "When you left, I said there would be no place if you returned. I was angry, afraid, and I was wrong." His eyes flicked to Jan's scar. The stories were true then. The sea takes its price, but the farm needs hands. You'll start tomorrow. Eastfield needs clearing for spring planting. Relief surged through January. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it was home. That night, Jan lay in the loft with his brothers. The straw mattress felt impossibly soft compared to a ship's deck. His siblings whispered late into the night, hungry for stories. He told them some, softening the horrors, gilding the wonders. He wondered if he should warn them more sternly. Yet he remembered his own restless longing. Perhaps some lessons could only be learned in salt and storm. As sleep claimed him, he realized he belonged here. And yet, part of him still belonged to the sea. The first days back on the farm passed in a blur of labor. Dawn to dusk, Jan's hands were busy with familiar tools: pitchfork, plow, scythe. His sailor's calluses adapted quickly, his body hardened by sea toil, making farm work almost easy. Yet each chore, though comforting, carried an undertone of strangeness. The creak of leather harnesses, the lowing of cattle, the smell of tilled earth. So unlike the salt air, tar, and constant motion of a ship. His father gave orders sparingly but watched with hawk-like eyes. Jan sensed he was being tested, weighed, measured for his sincerity. He threw himself into the work, determined to prove that he was not the reckless boy who had fled a year before. He was older now, tempered by storms and battles. And yet, beneath the satisfaction of sweat and soil, something tugged at him. At night, lying in the loft with his brothers, the farm's stillness pressed upon him. He missed the creak of timbers, the rhythm of waves, the whistle of the bosun's pipe. He sometimes woke gasping from dreams of ratlins breaking beneath his hands, or storms that never ended. Other nights, he dreamed of open horizons and endless skies, only to wake staring at low rafters and the flicker of firelight from below. His brothers pestered him endlessly. "Tell us again about the flying fish. What did Batavia smell like? Did you see pirates?" Their eyes shone with envy and awe. Jan answered patiently, but inside he wrestled with guilt. His words fed the very fire that had driven him from the farm. Would they too one day seek the sea, only to learn its merciless lessons? His sister, now nearly grown, watched him differently. She asked about people instead of storms, about Javanese women selling spices in the markets, about children playing barefoot in the streets, about strange languages and music. She hung on his every word. For her, his stories were windows into a world she would never see. Their mother tended to him with quiet devotion, slipping extra portions onto his plate, fussing over his clothes, brewing salves for old rope burns. Sometimes she watched him as if afraid he might vanish again, her eyes shining with unshed tears. But his father remained guarded. He gave him tasks, measured his work, and spoke little. Only once, after a long day of mending fences, did he pause beside January. "You're stronger," he said simply. Jan looked at him, startled, unsure if it was praise or warning. His father gave no clue. Weeks passed. Spring melted into summer. The rhythms of farm life returned, planting, tending, repairing, harvesting. Jan's body adjusted, but his spirit chafed. Every time he saw seabirds wheeling overhead, something twisted inside him. He would pause, pitchfork in hand, eyes following the gulls as they vanished west toward the unseen sea. His father noticed, though he said nothing. One evening, after supper, Jan sat mending a leather harness. His hands worked automatically, sailor's knots repurposed for farm gear. His father settled by the fire, pipe smoke curling into the rafters. Silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of wood. Then his father spoke. "You're not staying." The words weren't a question. They fell like an axe splitting wood. Jan looked up, startled. I don't know." "You do." His father's eyes were steady, unreadable. "You think I haven't seen you watching the sky, hearing gulls? You're restless. The farm cannot hold you." Shame and relief warred inside January. "I don't want to leave again," he confessed. "Not after what it did to you, to Mother. But," he broke off, struggling to explain the unexplainable. "The sea, it's in me now. I can't seem to shake it." His father stared into the fire, face lit by its glow. For a long time he said nothing. Then, "A man must find his own road." I was wrong before trying to bind you here. The sea is your road, walk it. But know this, you'll always have a place here now. Whether you stay or go or return years later, this remains your home." The words lifted a weight Jan hadn't realized he carried. His throat tightened. "Thank you, Father," he whispered. His father nodded once, matter of fact. Then they sat in silence again, two men, not father and son, bound by respect. That night, Jan dreamed not of storms or death, but of white sails billowing on calm seas, the horizon glowing with dawn. And always, behind him, a farmhouse with smoke curling from the chimney. A harbor to return to. Still, the question lingered, how long could he resist the call? The summer sun lingered late over the fields, casting the sky in hues of amber and rose. Jan sat outside after a day's work, his body tired but his mind restless. He traced idle patterns in the dirt with a stick, watching swallows dart after insects in the warm evening air. The smell of cut hay hung heavy, mingling with the faint scent of smoke from the kitchen fire. He didn't hear his mother until she sat beside him on the bench. She carried no basket, no work in her hands, a rare thing. For a while she said nothing, simply sitting, her presence both comforting and watchful. Finally she spoke. "You're thinking of the sea again." Jan glanced at her, startled. Her tone was quiet but certain. Not a question. He sighed. "Can you tell?" "A mother always can," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Your eyes are too far away. Even when you sit right here, they're not in these fields. They're out there on some endless horizon." He wanted to deny it, to ease her heart. But what good would that do? She knew the truth already. "I try," he said softly. "Every day. The work is good, the food better than any ship, the air clean. But at night I dream of sails. I dream of waves." She nodded slowly. "It's in your blood." Her words surprised him. "In my blood." She gazed out at the fading sky, her eyes distant. "My brother, your uncle, sailed with the herring fleet before you were born. I never told you. He was the same as you. Couldn't stay on land no matter how much he tried. He was lost in a storm off the English coast." Jan blinked. "I never knew." "I didn't want you to know," she admitted. "When you left with the company, I feared you would meet his fate. When the months passed with no word, I prayed every night. And when I saw your scar," she reached out, touching his cheek gently, "I thought my worst fears had come true." "I'm sorry," Jan whispered. "No," her grip tightened on his hand. "Don't be sorry for who you are. A bird must fly, a fish must swim, and some men must go to sea. I see that now. But you must promise me something." He waited, heart pounding. "If you go again, and I know you will, come back to us. Don't vanish as you did before, leaving us to wonder if you live or lie at the bottom of the ocean. Write when you can. Visit when you return. Don't let the sea take you from us completely." Jan swallowed hard. The lump in his throat made it difficult to speak. "I promise," he said, and meant it with all his heart. Her eyes softened. "That is all I ask." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, as she had when he was a boy. "You've brought sorrow into this house, January, but also pride. Never doubt that." The words pierced him deeper than any storm-tossed splinter. Pride. He had not expected that. The sky deepened to violet. Crickets began their evening chorus. His mother rose, brushing her apron. "Come inside. There's bread and cheese waiting. And tomorrow there's work enough for all of us." Jan watched her go, his chest aching with a strange mix of love, guilt, and resolve. Her wisdom had given him what he hadn't dared hope for, permission. Not to abandon but to balance. To live both lives, the farm's rooted peace and the sea's restless call. He lifted his gaze to the horizon. In the fading light, he almost fancied he could see sails there, white against the darkness. The sea would claim him again soon. But this time he would not depart as a runaway son. He would leave as a man with ties strong enough to draw him home again. Autumn settled over the farm with its familiar weight. Days shortened, mornings began in mist, and the fields glowed golden with ripened grain. Jan worked beside his brothers, his hands steady on the scythe, his back strong under the sun. The rhythm of harvest was satisfying in its way, measurable progress, visible bounty, food that would carry the family through the winter. Yet beneath the surface of this contentment lay a persistent itch. Each swing of the blade, each armful of cut wheat piled onto the cart, left Jan wondering not about crops but about winds and tides. When he looked up from the fields, his eyes found the horizon, and he caught himself imagining masts rising in the distance. The villagers welcomed him warmly enough, though most treated him with cautious curiosity. To them, he was both familiar and foreign, the farmer's son who had seen places they knew only from traders' tales. Children whispered behind him, pointing at his scar, then daring each other to ask him about battles and storms. Jan laughed and obliged, but the questions gnawed at him. Every story he told rekindled the fire within him, the ache to return. At night, when the day's work was done, he sometimes slipped outside alone. The fields lay silent under the stars, the river winding dark and secret through the land. He'd stand there listening, waiting, and often in the quiet he thought he could hear the sea. Not its roar, but the faint pull of its vast breath calling him back. His father noticed. He said little, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. One evening, as they worked side by side repairing a fence, his father spoke in his blunt way. "You'll leave again." Jan's hand stilled. "I don't deny it," his father cut in. "I see it in your face every time the geese fly south. You don't belong only to this soil anymore." Jan bowed his head. "I want to stay. Truly I do." But he struggled, words inadequate to capture the endless restlessness inside him. "The sea won't let me go." His father tightened the rope they were securing, then straightened slowly. "Then go. Better to follow your own road than rot here in resentment. Just remember your mother's words. Return to us. Make this your anchor, even if you sail the farthest oceans." Jan felt a surge of gratitude, though he could not yet bring himself to admit his decision aloud. Winter came. Snow blanketed the farm, fields lay silent, and life shrank to the barns, hearth, and steady routine of survival. Chopping wood, tending cattle, repairing tools. Jan grew restless. He dreamed more vividly than ever of foreign ports, Stockholm's icy harbor, Lisbon's sunlit streets, Batavia's spice-laden air. He awoke from these dreams both exhilarated and unsettled, his body twitching as if already climbing rigging or hauling sails. By candlelight he began to count his coins. Wages saved from the company, profit from the spices, the modest earnings from farm labor. Enough, perhaps, to keep him in Amsterdam until he found another ship. Not the East Indies this time, that was too long, too brutal, but a shorter voyage. The Baltic, the Mediterranean. Routes where he could test whether the sea truly owned him. The decision formed not in a single moment, but in countless small ones. A gull wheeling inland against a gray sky, a story told in the tavern about a ship bound for Stockholm, the sight of his scarred hands mending nets in the barn instead of rigging aloft. By midwinter he knew. He told his family by the fire one evening. His mother sighed, her eyes wet but resigned. His brothers looked half envious, half relieved. His sister squeezed his hand, her expression proud. His father simply nodded, as though he had expected it all along. "After winter," Jan said, "I'll stay through the cold months, help with the work. But come spring I'll go." His father blew out a long breath. "Then we'll make good use of you while you're here." And so Jan's fate was sealed. That night, he dreamed not of storms or splintered decks, but of white sails glowing in dawn light, a ship riding strong on a fair wind. Behind it, always, smoke curling from a farmhouse chimney. The horizon called, and he would answer. The winter dragged on, each day measured in firewood consumed and livestock tended. Jan worked hard, rising before dawn with his brothers, shoveling snow from the barn doors, mending harnesses, splitting timber until his shoulders ached. Yet even as he threw himself into the farm's rhythm, he felt the invisible clock ticking toward spring. Every log stacked, every tool repaired, carried him closer to departure. When storms rattled the shutters, he sat by the hearth with his father, their hands busy with leather and rope. His father rarely spoke of Jan's decision, but sometimes questions slipped through. "What signs do you look for out on the sea?" he asked one night, his voice casual but his eyes intent. Jan explained, cloud formations that foretold storms, the sudden hush of birds before heavy weather, the feel of pressure shifting in his bones. His father listened with a craftsman's curiosity, nodding at each detail. It struck Jan then. His father wasn't simply tolerating his choice. He was trying to understand it, to bridge the gap between land and sea. His mother prepared practical gifts. Herbs to fight scurvy, sturdy shirts sewn with extra care, a pouch of dried apples for the voyage. To remind you of home when you're far away, she said softly as she folded them into his sea chest. Jan hugged her, struck by how her love made parting both harder and easier. His sister lingered near him often, begging for stories. Sometimes she grew quiet, her brow furrowed. "You'll come back, won't you?" she asked one evening, almost in a whisper. "I promise," he said, echoing the vow he had made to their mother. "This time I'll always return." She nodded, satisfied, though her eyes betrayed doubt. Even his brothers, once wide-eyed with envy, grew more solemn as the days shortened towards spring. "Maybe one day we'll go too," one admitted. Jan gripped his arm firmly. "Be sure before you do. The sea gives little mercy." His words held a weight learned the hard way. By February the snow began to soften. Meltwater trickled along ditches and gulls wheeled overhead, their cries stirring Jan's heart like a summons. Each day's thaw brought him closer to the road back to Amsterdam. At last, on a morning clear and cold, he gathered his family by the hearth. His sea chest stood packed by the door. His father sat with pipe in hand, his mother with a folded kerchief, his siblings crowding near. "I'll leave tomorrow," Jan said. "There's a merchant's wagon headed north. Will take me part of the way. From there, I'll find my own road to the harbor." His mother dabbed her eyes but did not protest. His sister bit her lip, nodding bravely. His brothers looked at him with a mix of admiration and apprehension. His father drew deeply on his pipe, then exhaled. "You've done well here this winter. You've worked hard. You've kept your word. That's all a man can do." He leaned forward. "Remember this, January. The sea may carry you far, but it will not anchor you. That you must do yourself. Let this farm be that anchor." Jan swallowed hard. "I will." The next morning dawned bright, sunlight glinting off melting frost. Jan lifted his sea chest onto the waiting wagon, his muscles straining with its weight. His father walked with him to the crossroads, boots crunching on the frozen ground. They stood together in silence, the farm stretching behind them, the road to Amsterdam ahead. Finally, his father spoke. "Fair winds, my son." Jan gripped his hand firmly. "I'll be back." Then he climbed aboard the wagon. As the horses pulled forward, the farm receded into the distance, shrinking with each turn of the wheels. But unlike his first departure, Jan did not feel exile. This time he left with a blessing, with an anchor to return to. Amsterdam awaited, the harbor, the ships, the horizon. The sea's call was strong, irresistible. Yet in his chest, balanced against that pull, lay the steady weight of home. The wagon rolled north for 3 days, stopping at villages along the road. Jan rode among sacks of grain and casks of beer, his sea chest wedged tight against the boards. The farmer who drove the wagon spoke little, content to let the horses set the pace. For Jan, the journey was a strange mixture of anticipation and calm. He was no longer the naive farm boy who had first stumbled into Amsterdam's docks, dazzled and unprepared. He returned now as a man who had faced storms and famine, disease and death, and survived. On the morning of the 4th day, the spires of Amsterdam pierced the mist. The familiar smells of tar, fish, and smoke reached him even before the city came fully into view. His heart quickened. Here, among the tangle of masts and sails, his next chapter waited. He parted ways with the farmer at the city gates, shouldered his sea chest, and made his way toward the harbor. The port bustled with spring activity. Shipwrights hammered in the yards, merchants shouted over crates of goods, gulls wheeled and screamed overhead. Everywhere, men prepared for voyages, to the Baltic, the Mediterranean, and, for the boldest, the distant East Indies once more. Jan found lodging at the same hostel where he had stayed after his first return. The keeper, a retired sailor with a missing leg, recognized him instantly. "Back again, are you?" he said with a knowing grin. "If I can find the right ship," Jan replied. "You will. Spring always brings plenty of sails hungry for hands." Over the next days, Jan walked the docks, inquiring at shipping offices and speaking with crews. This time he asked questions before signing. What was the captain's reputation? Where was the ship bound? How long would the voyage last? He was no longer desperate. He was deliberate. One afternoon, he ran into Peter in a dockside tavern. The older sailor looked weathered but steady, gray creeping into his hair. "I thought you'd gone back to the farm for good," Peter said, sliding a mug of beer toward him. "I did. Through the winter. But the sea," Jan smiled faintly. It doesn't let go. Peter chuckled knowingly. It never does. What are you looking for? Something shorter than the Indies? Baltic Run, maybe Mediterranean? A chance to keep my hand to the trade without vanishing for years. Peter nodded. Smart. As it happens, I've signed on with the Nordstar. Good ship, bound for Stockholm and Riga. Solid captain, fair pay. They're still looking for men. You should come. Jan agreed to meet the first mate the next morning. At the Nordstar's berth, the ship gleamed in the spring light. Smaller than the Batavia's Pride, but trim and well kept. Her rigging was tight, her decks freshly scrubbed. The first mate, a no-nonsense Frisson named Hendrik, questioned Jan briskly about his experience. When Jan mentioned his time aboard the company ship to Batavia, Hendrik's brows rose. Survived the Indies, did you? Then you'll be worth 3 green hands. We sail in 3 days. 10 guilders a month, plus cargo privileges. Do you sign? Jan didn't hesitate. I sign. He pressed his name to the ship's articles with steady hand. Not with the reckless eagerness of youth, but with the calm certainty of a man choosing his path. The days before sailing passed quickly. Jan purchased a thick wool coat, extra stockings, and a fur-lined cap for Baltic weather. He wrote a letter to his family, entrusted to a traveling merchant, promising to return by midsummer. He walked the docks at sunset, breathing in the tang of salt air, the gulls' cries like a hymn in his ears. On the morning of departure, Jan reported to the Nordstar before dawn. Sailors swarmed the decks, loading final provisions, coiling lines, stowing gear. He slung his chest into the berth assigned to him. A hammock this time, not the bare planks of the company ship. Progress. Peter clapped him on the shoulder. Ready, Jan? As I'll ever be, Jan said, eyes on the horizon. The mooring lines were cast off, the sails unfurled. The Nordstar leaned into the wind, her prow cutting cleanly through the water. Amsterdam's spires receded behind them, and ahead stretched the endless sea. Jan stood at the rail, the wind whipping his hair, his scar pulling faintly at his skin. He felt no fear this time, only a steady resolve. He had his anchor now, his family, his farm, the promise of return. The sea could no longer claim him entirely. As the gulls wheeled overhead and the sails filled with the breath of spring, Jan smiled. He was a sailor still, marked by the sea forever. But he was also a son, a brother, a man with roots on land. And between the two worlds he had found his balance. The horizon beckoned. And Jan, heart steady and spirit unbroken, sailed toward it, knowing that wherever the winds carried him, there would always be a home to return to.